Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. My name's Mark Tyers. I'm the co-founder of Formation Tech. I've got with us today our head of technology, Mike Gilroy-Scott. And please do, throughout the webinar, feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and we'll look at those and answer those either in flight or after the webinar, or it will form the basis of what we talk about to a degree. But just as an introduction, we've done a good number of these Teams webinars now focusing on voice, and it's just really interesting that every time we do this, we do these monthly, how much changes in the market, how much changes from a product perspective. And going back to when we started these, look, 2 or 3 years ago, mid-pandemic, there's a big rush to the cloud, and for a lot of those people, the focus was on just cloud voice. They had a legacy PBX, they needed voice to be in the cloud because everyone was working remotely. Now, some wanted a platform to do everything: voice, instant messaging, and video. And for those not going for Teams, there's the players like 8x8 and RingCentral in the market who were providing that full end-to-end piece. And customers now, interestingly, fall into broadly 2 spaces for us. We're seeing people who still have legacy equipment, and they've been driven by predominantly 2 things. There's the big switch off in 2025, which is obviously making a lot of those legacy systems truly redundant, but also that need for simplification of their user experience by bringing all these things together: the IM, the video, and the voice. And quite interestingly, a lot of these pandemic adopters, the ones who were moving to that single application at the time, are now finding that they no longer have a single application. They have IM and they have video and Teams, and they have their voice sitting in the platform which they originally adopted to do that. So we're finding a lot of businesses now talking to us and saying, well, actually, our single application is Teams. How do we bring voice into it? So for today's webinar, we're going to cover 5 topics, sort of on the basics. How can you connect Teams voice? How does it work? What are the basics of that? I'm going to touch on a couple of business cases, use cases as to why people move. The big switch off, it's a big topic. It impacts different businesses in different ways. And in a similar topic, people moving away from legacy infrastructure, there's a lot of features and functions they may be used to that they think, well, can I do that in Teams? And we've got some answers to that. And I always like to finish these webinars on what's coming in the future. Mike spends a lot of time with Microsoft and in the market generally, and has really good insights on that. So let's get on to the first topic, really. So, I mean, sort of the basics, really, Mike. Can you perhaps just outline for us some of the ways in which you can connect into Teams voice?
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Mark. Yeah, so Microsoft Teams, most of you people are joining, hopefully be familiar with the application and what it can do. Voice is just a feature set of that product, but in order to get your phone calls into the platform, you need one of 2 things. You need a license for the users who need to use that feature, and then you need some infrastructure to provide the connectivity to the PSTN or the public switch telephone network or the outside world for the phone numbers. There are a few ways of achieving this. One, the simplest and most basic way is to use Microsoft's licensing and calling plans, as it's called. So basically Microsoft will be your telco, and you would port your numbers to them. Not a lot of people pick up that option, or the people who have picked up that option have since moved off because they've got better flexibility and capabilities with the carriers that they want to work with. The second connection type is something called Operator Connect, where the carriers themselves have done a deal with Microsoft and are basically providing the infrastructure, carrier management, number management directly into Microsoft Teams infrastructure, so that those numbers are available through the admin center, etc. It's all very corporate and enterprise kind of arrangements, and it's better suited to sort of global organizations to provide that kind of service, usually with people with existing contracts with big carriers in that space. And then the third kind of do it all, everything for everyone solution called direct routing for the slightly smaller people who are not carriers, who are not operating their own networks. And this method is the most flexible, gives you all of the features, and just gives you lots of options to be able to bring in multiple carriers at your choice, all those sorts of things, and deliver a customized service into Microsoft Teams. So just as a recap, you need to license the users, and then you need to provide the infrastructure through either an operator or through a partner such as Formation.
Yeah, and going back to how the market's been driven, clearly when people first started looking at Microsoft Teams, whether it be the pandemic or afterwards, the sort of rush to that, a lot of people did go calling plans, and that's very much driven by a kind of a fairly familiar price per user type model. Do you want to perhaps touch upon the approach that that we've seen kind of works quite well in the market, given that voice now is just a component of collaboration. It's not the big siloed platform that is the only way people communicate. It's just a part of what people do now.
Absolutely. I mean, the sort of advent of software as a service took a big kick through the pandemic, and that really started it off. And software providers and vendors love to sort of charge per user. It's very simple. It's easily manageable. When it comes to voice in Teams, because we're all moving into this more collaborative environment, the actual usage of calling has actually reduced. So the thought of giving a user their own license, their own capabilities, their own minutes and things like that, you're tending to give them more than they actually need. So what we looked in the market, and we were going, right, well, everyone's kind of doing this price per user kind of model. But actually, we're looking at it from a more how you would buy your bandwidth from your internet service providers, and we're looking at sort of a consumption basis. So how many calls are you actually making, rather than how many users do you need to enable? We then build the infrastructure to fit and to suit your requirements, and then charge you a rate based on bracketed sizes of that. So what that gives you is that sort of predictable cost for the infrastructure to operate, because it's based around how many calls you're making simultaneously, and as long as that doesn't fluctuate hugely, then we can size something that's appropriate to your usage, rather than kind of the number of users you've got.
I mean,
We do offer
ironically,
both models as well. Actually, we can offer per user licensing if that works out better for your usage type.
I mean, ironically, it's not dissimilar to how you might have bought a phone system many years ago. You've got 100
Yeah,
people, you need this ratio of calls, and it kind of is a similar balance.
it's the
But
same thing. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I guess moving on to the next topic really, and I think that probably covers. I mean, it is a fairly basic element of how we bring the service in. But the reasons people are moving. So business case, user cases, what's driving that market right now? And again, it is changing, isn't it? But
Yes, this one's a
what are you
really
seeing?
interesting one. So it's from what we're seeing, it's kind of a mixture. It's from people who still have managed to sort of sweat that on-prem legacy PBX or phone system they've had, and they're finally making that move into the cloud. And actually, the other one that we're spending quite a lot of time on is actually people who picked up very early well, not early adopters, but very quickly had to adopt something like a Ring Central or an 8x8 at the beginning of the pandemic, because they needed to cloudify their comms in order to be able to support their remote working. And now all of those contracts are 3 years old, and they're all coming to an end. They're now looking at it going, well, I've got this another application which we're having to manage, and actually I've got an application over here that's operating and driving my business where all my existing collaborations is taking place. Why do I need two applications that can do the same thing? And a lot of people are going, you know what, I can dump that and just do the same thing over here. So actually, interestingly, bizarrely, those kind of big cloud phone system providers, they're losing out to Microsoft Teams because it's so ingrained in kind of people's day-to-day flow of work.
And we were talking before this webinar, and there were the two phrases that you used, which I've not heard you use with the customer. I'm definitely using them from now on. And there were two phrases. One was application sprawl, and one was it's not an app, it's a feature. And
Yes.
it was we did a case study and a deployment, which I can mention a name because we've written the case study for the National Gallery, fairly recently. And there was a few interesting points came out of that, in that they had a legacy environment. They also had, we'll move on to the big switch off in a minute, because clearly a very large gallery, got lots of sort of lift lines and phones and such like dotted around that they didn't want to replace the cabling for. But when that deployment was completed, it was like, well, I didn't have to really train my users, because they were just already familiar with it. And also from an IT perspective, they had one guy who knew a lot about that platform, but not much the team did. But going into Teams, everyone was fairly familiar. Also got a support desk to sort of sit behind that. But that as a kind of case in hand for driving that requirement, it sort of really ticked all the boxes for why a lot of people moving to Teams.
Absolutely, it's that sort of consolidation of platforms. Many businesses will have this problem where they've got hundreds, possibly even thousands of applications to drive their business, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And if you've got something that you've already got an IT team that's familiar with the application, then that's a really beneficial point to it, and there's very little for them to learn. And likewise for the users, that kind of ability to just say, actually, you've just got a new button in the application you're already using. We don't need to deliver a new application to your mobile phones to give you that mobility. It's there, it works, we switch it on, you barely even notice, you just suddenly take PSTN calls on it rather than just Teams to Team calls. And usually what we're finding is that they're happy from day one. That's not to say we don't offer, sort of training and user adoption training services, because sometimes people like to have all of the features explained to them and show them how they work. So yeah, we can help customers with that. Just back to the National Gallery, actually, just on the topic of the legacy, they had lots of sort of security phones, these analog phones, the little cubby holes, etc., connected back to a legacy phone system. They had lift lines, they had control room for security with all loads of monitors and everything. So they had all of those things that were running via the phone system. And one of the things they were concerned about is that, oh, if we move to Teams, we can't support any of that. And one of the great things about that engagement is we went in, because we're using these direct routing services, we say, well, actually, we've got the flexibility to support all of that and make it part of your Teams deployment. You don't have to ditch it. You don't have to find another solution for it. We can do the whole lot. We could, because we're from that world. We understand how it all works, and we can just blend that with your Teams rollout.
And the for people who don't know, the infrastructure we bring in to sites to provide effectively these converters, aren't they, converting analog to IP or to SIP, are the same as we host in the cloud. So, but by default, these options are providing resilience, and there's a whole window depending on the business requirement and how they work. Again, by not having to move your lines into Microsoft, you've got a Microsoft outage. You can bring your trunks to route either to the cloud or to on site, and you bring some resilience. Did I see a question just pop up?
Yeah,
right?
I've just read the question from Jacqueline as you were answering that. Interestingly, Jacqueline, we're literally just about to move on to that topic, so you've prompted it wonderfully. But actually, we've just got a little section in between. If you're okay to hang on for just a few minutes, and we'll touch on the 8x8, that omni-channel piece. Yeah. So yeah, over to you, Mark. Sorry, next section.
Great. Yeah. So and I guess we're in this sort of topic that we're talking about right now. It straddles the big switch off as well, because whilst in that situation we're talking about analog and legacy devices inside the business. That same thing is actually driving a lot of businesses who may have looked at this in the past and, well, I can't move to the cloud because I've got these things, but right now they're saying I just have to do it because, well, I don't really have a choice. And there may be some organizations we work with who have like lots of sites in far-flung places that can't get the right level of capacity, or just don't want to invest in another bit of plastic to sit on the desk. So actually those sort of resilient and legacy options. You've got any other examples to touch on before we move on to the next subject?
No, it's more just some of the things that people misconceptions around Teams. It's people. I get regular questions like, "Oh, can I do an auto attendant or an IVR in Teams?" Yes, you can do an auto attendant IVR in Teams. Can I do call queues in Teams? Yes, you can do call queues in Teams. Can I do announcements? Yes, I can. Can I do voicemail to email? Yes, you can. Can I do call pickups? Can I do round robin calling? All of those sort of things. Bizarrely, I still get these kind of questions, and they're really, really simple yes answers. That's not to say Teams can solve all of the telecoms. It's not a phone system. What it is a collaboration platform that has phone-like functionality. So 8x8 and Ring Central are designed to provide full telecoms features. But what Microsoft have done, and this segues nicely onto this next section around what do you do when you come across a feature that you can't get natively in Teams? And the great thing about it, and I'm only allowed to say ecosystem once in this webinar, otherwise I'll get carried away, but Microsoft provide it likes having partners as developers for its platform. So it's like, what, we don't want to go out and solve these things natively, but we will open up to our partners to be able to develop for our platform. A good example is, call recording. Microsoft can do call recording natively for a Teams meeting or a Teams one-to-one call, but as soon as you bring the PSTN element into it, it goes, what, that's the bread and butter of the call recording platforms. Here's the mechanism for them to achieve that in Microsoft Teams, and then they provide a certification program. So if you pick any of those vendors, it's going to work with their platform. Likewise with sort of call reporting, for example, if people are going, I need to know what kind of stats my team are doing, how many incoming calls will we doing, how long does it take us to answer? Whilst you can get this information out of the Teams admin center using the CSVs, and they provide some basic Power BI templates for you. They're provided as is, and you're kind of doing all the work. There is a swathe of vendors who will take a direct feed from the Microsoft Graph API and take all that information, and analyze it, convert it, put it into information and reporting and dashboards and stuff for you, and actually give you a much better experience than probably what Microsoft could do.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Mike, looking at another case study, another business case example, that with people like dotted around working hybrid, working in the office, people don't really know how organizations are performing. And a lot of businesses, again, post-pandemic, sort of have this blend of, or we use mobiles, it kind of works for us. But the reason phone systems were introduced in the very first instance was to allow someone to call someone, and if they weren't available, to speak to a colleague in a group, etc. And it might be worth touching channels and calling as part of that. But when you can actually start to report on, to say, look, I've got these call peaks at this time for this group, whether it be a sort of membership line or whether it be a service line. You say, well, I get my peaks and troughs here. You can start to manage that sort of stuff. And like the traditional call loggers, setting reports automated at the end of a week to see sales performance, etc., etc. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, no, that's all really good. Actually, it's a good point, because natively some of that sort of information is difficult to get out of Microsoft if you move to it as a voice platform. But there are various vendors who do the historical reporting, but there's also vendors who will do more real time. And we're sort of moving. I can see there's a couple of questions around 8x8 in there, in sort of making Teams your native contact center. Now, Microsoft have this integration levels. It's got connect, extend, and power, and I'm not going to sort of go into each of those three, but connect is a very basic SIP trunking service to connect it in, where you have a contact center application, you route calls in, out to the contact center, back into Teams, and it's all very calls going all over the place. And then the extend is actually natively built in Microsoft as an application. The call comes into Teams, it never leaves Teams, it routes through the contact center engine and then back into and it distributes the calls to the Teams users as a Teams call. So there's no kind of separate application, there's no kind of routing calls off to get recorded. It's all done natively within the tenant. So there are a few vendors who have got certification at that stage, and what that allows you to do is get proper real-time visibility of incoming calls and busy times and heat maps and agent performances and redirect on no answers, so you can see who's not taking calls. You can see how many people are available in each of your services or call queues to take calls. So all of that you can't get natively in Teams, but these vendors will provide you applications, will give you that visibility and that native kind of contact center experience. Are they as mature as the kind of dedicated contact center vendors out there, the Five9s, the Genesis Clouds out there? Probably not right now, but it won't be long before essentially parity is reached and Teams will become that kind of de facto voice channel, and the contact center will just integrate seamlessly in with it. So you're not buying two platforms, you're just buying an application on top of your existing platform, which is probably more traditional.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Azure Communication Service that's sitting in the background has got huge capabilities, and some of the acquisitions and things with OpenAI that Microsoft have done. It's really fascinating where that's all going to go. On the same topic of kind of integrated applications, I think it's worth mentioning attendant consoles. We're seeing a lot of businesses who have adopted Microsoft before we spoke to them, who it seems to a lot of education, actually. A lot of schools we're working with just now, it's not unique to that, but where you have organizations who do take in a lot of calls to a centralized function. Again, Teams works because you can see someone whether on a call, if they're in a meeting, hosting a webinar, or whatever they're doing. But by having an attendant console, you may have used to have that in a legacy phone system. You do lose that a little bit natively in Teams. So probably a good time to talk on that.
Obviously, you mentioned it, handling calls in Teams is personally possible. So if you have low volume amount of calls on a reception desk, then absolutely you could use a handset, you could use the application to handle calls. But if you're slightly more kind of centralized around a service desk, having a attendant console to be able to identify the caller, to integrate with the CRM, to pick up who the caller is and even potentially route that caller based on who the caller is. For example, you can pick up that information, you can screen pop into various numbers of CRMs, and then because these things are native Teams applications, you're benefiting from the ability to tap into all of the native applications, such as calendaring, for example. So you can have your list of people, these are your speed dials or favorites, and you can actually see if someone says, oh, when are they next available, rather than open up Outlook and find their calendar, open it up, have a scroll through, find the day. You literally can click in your attendant without leaving your attendant console. You can actually see their schedule for the day at a touch of a button. You can say they're in meetings till 3 o'clock, call after then. You know, all of those great kind of integrations, because it's these applications are native to the Teams experience.
And interestingly, with the attendant console for the way in which we configure it, there's also a much nicer GUI-led integration for things like IVRs. Dave mentioned it obviously sits natively in Teams.
Yeah.
And again, a couple of customers we've spoken to who have onboarded themselves or been onboarded, you know, maybe not fully into their sort of to that ultimate requirements, have found that as an option again is quite self-managing and quite intuitive. Perhaps worth touching on that, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. So the IVR or auto attendant functionality in Microsoft Teams is incredibly powerful. But what I would say is if you have multi-layer IVRs, just because of the way Teams routes calls around its platform, it can get very complex. And while it's provided a GUI to provide the configuration, it doesn't give you that workflow style drag and drop, connect up the various components visibility. But again, these contact center vendors will solve those kind of problems for you. And again, because they're operating on the extend certification with Microsoft, they're using all the contact center APIs to do all of that management. It's native in Teams, so the call isn't leaving Teams at any point.
Fantastic. This sort of leads on to, we were discussing to sort of future development areas that we were talking about earlier, and there was one point we discussed prior to the webinar around the integration of chat and voice as a future thing. This isn't a native Microsoft piece, but it's quite interesting in the context of contact center and collaboration.
Yeah, so I've mentioned this extend integration as well as Connect, which is your basic extend, which is the one I've primarily been talking about. But then there's the one above it is Power. And now Power is based around what's called Azure Communication Services, and that's basically omni-channel functionality, so voice, video, chat, essentially. So one of the new announcements for one of the vendors that we work with will allow you to essentially route chat calls as they would be voice calls. So you can use skills-based routing on web chat coming into your business. So it will hunt like it would a voice call, etc. So this is quite an exciting announcement from one of our partners, Luware in this particular case. They announced and presented this at Comms First just the other week. So you will be able to route inbound chat calls from your website through a skills-based routing engine and distribute that to your staff and directly into Teams. And it'll just be a native experience. And coming down the road, you'll be able to escalate those chats to voice and video calls at a later date.
Because there's also the function around channel calling, which I sense is not as widely used as perhaps it was going to be when it came out, but where, you know, if you have a mature channel setup, and a lot of people have quite a chaotic, hectic channel setup in organizations, depends on how well managed it is. But you do have an opportunity there to also create hunt groups through that sort of method, don't you?
Absolutely, and it was kind of Microsoft's original sort of attempt to sort of solve that visibility about who is in your group, who's available to take calls, have like a central call history for particular teams. But it did prove a bit clunky to do. Now, I have heard on the grapevine that actually Microsoft are attempting to maybe bring out their own contact center functionality, which is based on this collaborative calling, which is what Microsoft are calling it. So it'd be interesting to see. I haven't actually seen anything official on that at the moment, but I'm led to believe that is in the works. So it'd be interesting because they would be a competitor to their kind of partners in this. So it'd be interesting to see what that looks like and how that comes
it's always a difficult line to tread, isn't it? But I mean, we have another webinar we're doing in a month's time. A lot of changes in that time. And in fact, that is more focused specifically around contact center functionality, the more advanced features and functions required. So we covered a bit of that today, actually, but it's dedicated on that. So we'll follow up after today's webinar with a link to that. Come and join that, come and listen to that. We do these things monthly, and we're going to bring a couple of vendors into that to actually show some of the sort of stuff in action, so let's show you how it works. Look, we're on the topic of sort of future progressive stuff. You're very close to Microsoft. You have a good idea and good ear to the ground on these things. We were talking about the new Teams application that's coming out.
So many on this call will probably have been using Teams for a number of years, and as the features increase, as the number of whiz and bang things have come out, it's sort of become a bigger and bigger application. And some of you may have noticed that you need a quite high spec machine for it to run smoothly, especially if you're screen sharing or doing multiple things. Now, Microsoft recognized this, and in the last 18 months have been developing what they're calling Microsoft Teams 2.0. And it looks like they are accelerating the release of this application. And some of the headline figures around it are that it's going to be roughly 2 times faster to open and operate. It's going to have a much more lightweight footprint on the machine that you're running it on. And it'll just save you 5, 10, 15 seconds here and there during the day in each kind of action that you're operating in. So it's mainly a productivity kind of update. It's something that you can preview now. So if you talk to your IT teams about whether you can use the application in preview, one thing I would warn is that in preview you do lose some base functionality, like you can't use third-party apps in the preview mode at this current time. That may change in the next 2 months or so, but I'm led to believe that sometime this calendar year that will be generally available. So we can expect to see a performance improvement. And it's not just performance. They have sort of tidied up how things operate, how they look. Everything's a bit cleaner and a bit less messy as well. So it's looking bright for Teams. So keep an eye on that.
Fantastic. Look, we're just about coming to time. So as a quick summary, thanks for that, Mike. It's been really helpful, really interesting. We covered obviously how to connect to Microsoft Teams. Many of you may have come to the session knowing that already, but I hope that's been helpful. Again, a few bits around business cases. We've got a few case studies we've written recently. If you'd like to see any of those, we can obviously share them. If you have got challenges around big switch off, your analog devices, legacy devices, also those legacy features and functions you're using, the call reporting, call logging. I've seen there's another question from Jacqueline around costs of voice recording comparison to 8x8. It depends on the license you're using or what you're using it for. We're very happy to pick up with you on that post today's webinar and a bit around the future. So I hope everyone has found that really helpful in whatever journey you're on. So thanks again for joining. So is there any questions at all for the floor? Or otherwise we can wrap this up and we can
just give it a minute, see if there's anyone who can tap away. Yeah, Jacqueline, if you've got any further questions, feel free to reach out and we'll kind of have a one-to-one on that, discuss what you can or can't do. Yeah.
Good. Fantastic. Well, I think we've covered the key points today. So look, I will just say thank you again. Really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us to run through these topics. Please do reach out to us for any of those things. I'm sure we'll do the same and get in touch to find out how you found it. Look forward to hopefully seeing you in our next one. Many thanks again.
Lovely. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you then. Cheers. Bye-bye.